Thank you for tuning in to the Aging Well with VNA podcast series. The Visiting Nurse Association of Texas helps people age with dignity and independence at home. With our Aging Well with VNA podcast series, our goal is to help you and your loved ones understand options, know where to get help, and gain tools to communicate your wishes. Through education and proper planning, you'll be giving yourself peace of mind and your loved ones a gift.
Hi, my name is Kirsten Reddig, and I am a board member of Visiting Nurses Association, and I am here talking today with Gail Meyer and Cindy Nitschke. They are two employees of Visiting Nurses Association who are oversee the agency's hospice, grief, bereavement, and care part of the organization and services. And so, ladies, would you please introduce yourself to our audience and let everybody know what your specialties are here at the agency?
Okay, I'm Gail Meyer. My title is the Director of Family Care Services at the Visiting Nurse Association. I manage the bereavement program, which is our grief support program, and we follow people for 13 months after a death. And I manage the social workers and the chaplains and the volunteer program.
Great. That's a lot. How long have you been with the agency?
29 years next month.
That's fascinating. Well, congratulations. Thank you. You've touched a lot of hearts and souls in 29 years.
And they've touched mine.
What the gift. That's a tremendous gift. Cindy, tell us what you do for the agency and how long you've been here.
I am a hospice social worker, and I've been at VNA for 16 and a half years out in the field, going to facilities, going to patients' homes, going to hospitals, making visits to see our patients and families.
So it would seem like you deal with very heavy subject matter, which is loss and grief and death. And for some people, that might just be more negative emotion than they can possibly have in their lives. Do you feel that it's been a negative in your lives?
Someone said to me after a significant loss, we're not meant to waste our suffering. And that really has stuck with me. And I am helped by helping other people, actually.
That's awesome. And Gail?
I think all of us are in this profession. I was out in the field for many years as a social worker, is that we get so much more back than what we give. And we can truly see how people work through their grief and successfully, and it really is a joy to see people moving from point A to point B in that last life journey, in that passage of life.
And I know it makes a lot of difference for the families to have some assistance and social workers and help and chaplains and spiritual advisor during that time. So grief, 2020 was a tough year. Do you feel like grief is different today than it was in, say, 2019?
I think people are dealing with issues on a broader scale, such as isolation. So people have not had the support systems that they've had in the past. They've not been able to even go to a funeral in some cases. Their friends haven't been able to come to their house. So that is what I see is the major difference, is the isolation that people have felt when their loved one has passed away and they don't have that support system because the disease of COVID has not enabled people to get together and support that grieving person as they would have pre-COVID.
And even prior to someone's passing, the families have not been able to go into the hospital to be at their bedside. They've been banned from the hospital because of COVID, and that was understandable. The facilities have all worked very hard to try to keep the virus tamped down.
So what does that do to the surviving family? I mean, on top of the passing of a loved one, whether it was from COVID or not, what does that do to the surviving family members when they cannot have this big funeral or this religious ritual or sitting Shiva or having a celebration of life? What does that do to the grieving family? How does that affect them?
Well, they don't receive the support that they would pre-COVID have received. And that makes it hard for some people to move along because a funeral, a memorial service, is for the living.
I think it has made it much more difficult. And I think that many of them who were unable to go and be with their loved one as they were passing have also had to deal with feeling guilty that they weren't there to tell their loved one goodbye, spend time with them toward the end. And how guilty so many of them have felt, I think just adds to the difficulty then of working through their grief.
And when people have, we've had a tremendous amount of death, but we've also had other losses last year. Can you, and what I've heard over and over is people, the feeling that we feel is grief. Can you tell me some of the other things that people deal with of the sense of loss, whether it's loss of the sense of normalcy, loss of connection, and is that truly grief? Are they really grieving that loss, or is that something else?
I think there is something to that sense of grief because of that isolation. People have lost their normal way of life over the last year and a half. That connection with people is so important, and that social isolation then has such a negative effect on people. And I think that's what people mostly have been grieving, whether they miss going to a movie, whether they miss going to Aunt Jane's house for Christmas. I've seen some commercials on TV and just in the last week about family reunions, and it just brings tears to my eyes because the grandchildren are going to see their grandparents for the first time in a year and a half. So for that grandparent who has been grieving the loss of their family coming around for a year and a half, I think that is truly grief. I think they've all had hope that things would get better, but they truly, as they were going through that, did feel, I think it's a disconnection that they've been feeling, which has made them feel sad, lonely, isolated, and they've grieved over those losses. There truly are real losses when you are disconnected from other people.
I heard one really happy word there, and you said hope. So tell me about how hope plays into the death process and the grieving process.
Well, there's always something to hope for, even in hospice. And so in the beginning, a person with a terminal diagnosis might hope, well, there's one more treatment we could try. Maybe I could get into this trial. Maybe this will work. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. But they can still hope for being comfortable at home, being able to have their family around them, being able to write letters if they wish to leave for their family. So there's always something to hope for.
Is grief monolithic?
It only comes in one size, and that's extra large. And it doesn't matter if you're grieving the loss of a pet, the loss of a job to you, that's extra large grief. Losing a loved one, extra large.
Are there stages of grief? Is that a real thing? We've heard the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, finally acceptance. I've always heard about that as the stages of grief. And my father passed away recently, and I thought, what stage is my mom in of the stages of grief? So what is that? I mean, is that a real thing?
That was actually intended for the dying person, not for the family members of the dying person.
Oh, that's new information to me.
And it's definitely fluid. So you don't go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5, and it's over with.
There are no certificates given.
Right. And no certificate
It's fluid.
of achievement.
You go back and forth.
Right.
So you go through bargaining, you go through anger. You might think you're at acceptance, and then lo and behold, you're back at anger. And so people are up and down, and it takes a long, long time to get through that. And I think it's important to remember that those stages are fluid. It is not a straight line.
So originally, those stages of grief were meant for the dying person. So if you're given a terminal diagnosis, then you, as the patient, has to go through this. But I see it as being such an outwardly focused thing. I think. Does it make sense for someone, even though it is a fluid process, it's by no means a linear process, but is this also sort of a guide for the survivors that you will have these same processes of denial, anger, bargaining, depression?
I think we might experience some of that. And we're definitely going to go back and forth between emotions and being fine 1 minute and 10 minutes later you're in a puddle and at Tom Thumb.
Right. Has that happened to you?
Yes, it has.
Okay. I could tell you were speaking from experience. I've had a few too. I've had a few moments where I just...
You lost it.
Yeah, lost it.
And you never know when that's going to hit you.
Right.
So you might be in the car listening to a song on the radio, and there's just something about that song that reminds you of your loved one. You might be in Tom Thumb in line to check out groceries, and some thought of your loved one and you being in Tom Thumb together in that line, and it just hits you very unexpectedly.
And they say, scent and sound are very much, evoking memory. And I know when you're, someone lost their father right before Thanksgiving. And, Thanksgiving is such a traditional time and meal cooking and planning. And it's really the one holiday in America where, you're with family. And so how can someone who is having these different benchmarks, whether it's a birthday, I just had a birthday and it was the first birthday where I didn't get that call from my dad, and, someone's son is getting married and that's the first big family gathering where, her father's not going to be there. So, how can survivors have some set of peace or a strategy even to go into these situations?
Well, there's so many different things that people do, and there's no one right way. Many people try to pre-plan for those days that are important to them. So instead of having that family dinner with the same group of people on Thanksgiving, they may decide they're going to go to Florida for Thanksgiving. And start a whole new tradition, at least that first year, and because knowing that was going to be so painful for them. And then they may decide we're going to do this every Thanksgiving. They may decide, I know this is going to be a sad day, let's say the anniversary of their loved one's death, and they may try to plan, I'm going to get up in the morning. I know I will be crying, so I am going to plan that good cry for when I get up in the morning, and then I'm going to let those tears cleanse my system, and then I'm going to go on with my day. I have known many people who have done that. There's just so many different ways that people try to plan ahead, and for some, that's the only way they feel they can get through those difficult days.
And some people will choose to attend the family gathering. I tell them, don't have it at your house because then you can't leave.
That's excellent advice.
You need it out. And so you might tell the hostess, I'm going to come. I may leave right after the meal. I'm not sure how this is going to be.
Right.
But I want to be with you, but I may be cutting out early. Just let them know that.
So I've had members of my own family that have lost people, especially young people, and then one of the adult children gets married, and so they feel sad about their sibling not being at the wedding. And I've attended weddings where they have set up a table with a picture of that loved one and some things that were important to them. So, and it helped them to feel that person was with them that day. And I thought that was beautiful when I saw that.
That's really nice.
Again, it doesn't work for everybody, but it was a way to make the bride feel, in this particular case, that her brother was with her. It was very important to her to have him there. And they made sure that in their way, they could bring him there.
And I love that. let's talk about something kind of hard here. Is, people say, oh, the best and the worst come out in people in, funerals and weddings. And grief is painful. It's awkward. Some people are more emotive than others. Some people are more compassionate or empathetic than others. We have had situations where, in my case, my father was 89 when he died, and I literally had people say to me, well, 5,000 people died yesterday from COVID. Like, it's okay. Maybe, can you shed some light on how people feel it's okay to say that? Maybe they have experienced some kind of loss that they've never dealt with. Like, can you tell us about some of those comments and how maybe someone who's grieving can deal with that, or maybe someone can get a tip on being a little bit more compassionate?
When we work with our volunteers and we train them to make phone calls and go into people's homes, we actually do give them some tips about things not to say.
Okay, I'd love to hear them.
So we ask them not to say, well, this was God's plan. Mm-hmm. We try to help them say, well, you'll get over it. Just just get back in the swing of things,
right,
and you'll get over it.
I think, I'm so sorry to hear that. How are you doing? I think that's probably the best response.
And can it really just be that simple?
And just let them talk. I read something a long time ago in a book, and it said, after you've lost someone, you need to tell your story 100 times, and then you need to tell it another 100 times. Hopefully not to the same person.
Right, exactly.
But telling our stories is a way of healing. And, I'm so sorry for your loss. Tell me how you're doing.
So the comforter or the friend doesn't really have to say much of anything other than I'm sorry. And their role is to be a listener.
Right.
And there's a great art to listening.
We
don't have to fill up the spaces with just chatter that's meaningless to the person who's grieving.
Right.
It's about them. It's not about us.
Right.
And so just saying, I'm sorry. They may not be able to talk that day. They may not be able to tell you anything. But the next time you get together and you're with them and you say, I'm sorry, they may be at a point where they will open up and start sharing their experiences with that person or share their feelings about that person.
So when there is a death in a family, maybe it's a large family or a community, I have also seen where there's a little bit of competition on who's grieving more. Is that normal within family units and structures?
I suppose it can be, yes. Just like any kind of competition with siblings and family members on any other level, I suppose that competing for who's the best griever,
right?
And who's going
to
get over the quickest,
right? That's the ribbon you can have. You can be the most miserable.
Who can get over it the quickest?
Right.
So one adult child may say, well, I've worked through this. It's 6 months. I'm going on with my life. What's wrong with you?
Right.
You still seem to be grieving. That's ridiculous because I'm over my grief. So so we see a lot of that going on is expectations that, and frankly, no two people grieve at the same timetable. And I think that's very important to remember. We all, just like our coping skills, we cope in different ways. It doesn't mean one way is necessarily better than the other. We grieve in different ways, and we grieve on different timetables. And I think there has to be a respect for the people that you care for, that not every single person in that circle is going to grieve the same or on the same timetable.
You mentioned something earlier, tears are cleansing. I do know people who say, well, I've never grieved for my mother, or I've never cried, and I'm really proud of that. Tell me about that.
Well, I think there is something physiological about tears being cleansing. You have a good cry and you feel better. However, that's not everybody's way of coping with that grief. So there are people who may not cry. It's just not in their DNA to be a crier and do that. And again, it's having respect for the differences that you know, in raising children, if you have 2 children or 3 children, they're not alike. And they're going to do things in very different ways. And the same thing is true with grief. Not 3 people in one family are going to grieve exactly the same way. So you may have a crier, you may have somebody who just wears their feelings on their sleeve, and you may have somebody who tends to keep it in a little bit more, may use work as a way to get through that grief. Doesn't mean that one way is better than another. They're just different.
One of the things that I have heard is that after a person passes away and the family, maybe they start attending a different house of worship. I can't go back to that church where my husband was buried, or I really don't want to go back to work because everyone's going to be asking me. So what have you experienced, and how do you counsel as social workers and you're in this space? How do you talk to people about that?
Well, I think it goes back to everybody copes with grief differently. So that it may be too painful for that person to go back to that place of worship, and they want to start a new tradition and affiliate with a new place of worship. That's okay. That's all right.
I've had people say, I'm going to a different church. I don't want to talk to anybody. I want to sit in the back, and I want to cry when I want to.
Right.
And I'm going to leave before the last song.
Right.
That's what they need.
There's no judgment. There should be no judgment on how someone grieves, and whether it's, you know, a child who was taken young because of disease or an accident or a crime, or someone who died of COVID, or someone who died in their old age and passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by the ones they love. It's really important, I think, just to accept that grief is part of living, and it's part of it's like breath. I mean, we have to know how to do it. With a lot of things, we don't know how to do it because it's not something that you do every day. You know, if you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend and you break up with them, and then you have 5 more, well, then after 5 breakups, you're like, I know how to do this. With grief, it's really painful and different every single time, based on, obviously, your relationship with the person who passed away. So when people say, well, you'll have closure in a year. You will, time is the best healer. Do we ever get closure? Do we ever get over it?
I don't think you ever get complete closure. That person is always with you in your heart, and nobody can take that away from you. So I think that you learn how to live in a new way without that person. You can never go back. Things will never be the same, and I think that needs to be honored and acknowledged. But the challenge is finding new ways to live and new ways to make your life meaningful without that person, and hope that you will get to that place in your grief process to do that.
And hopefully at some point in your grief, those memories that brought you tears will bring you smiles or laughter.
You know, I read this, I think it was in Oprah magazine, and there was all of these different expressions of grief in different cultures. And, the Jewish tradition, they say, may his memory be a blessing. And I should have written them down and read them out today because they were so lovely. And last year, we all learned, because whether or not we lost someone to COVID, we were all so ripped apart by this enormous loss. In most of our lifetimes, there has never been so much profound loss of life in a short period of time. And we've had world wars where people have died, but this was a very short period of time, a lot of death. Does having so much loss all at one time possibly make it easier for one person to go through it because they're one among many? I lost my father, but 500,000 people died last year? Or do you sort of get lost in the shuffle? I mean, is it, we're all together in this, or is it, my grief means nothing because so many other people died?
I think loss is so personal. I think that each one is profound to that family member or friend who's experienced that loss. I don't think that the number of losses in the last year and a half make it easier.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes it harder in a way because there are so many and people are so disconnected that going through that grief process is more difficult. But I do think that each loss is just profound to that grieving person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the pandemic lessens your pain of loss.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it does at all.
How do we talk to kids about loss and grief? How do we help children through it?
Well, I think that we have to be honest with them. We have to be aware of where they are developmentally.
Mm-hmm.
The way you would talk to a 3-year-old is going to be different than the way you talk to a 13-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have to do a little bit of research and knowing those children and what can they comprehend and use the correct words that they comprehend. So many years ago, I did marriage and family counseling, and I had a client who they had muscular dystrophy in their family, and we were talking, and they had one healthy child, and they had 2 or 3 who either had already died of muscular dystrophy or were still living. And when they had those children, they didn't really know the diagnoses at the time, and it didn't come out until after all the children were born.
Oh.
So they kept talking. They shared a story that they kept using the word genes all the time to their healthy child, and all of a sudden he was like throwing a fit when it was time to get dressed, and they couldn't figure out what it was. Well, lo and behold, those genes were terrifying him.
Oh my gosh.
So just a simple thing like that, when they finally realized it, of course, then they were able to rectify it
Right.
and laugh about it later.
Right.
But just being cognizant of the words that you're using
Right.
with your children. And there's such a simple example of that child heard the word genes over and over and over in relation to muscular dystrophy.
And he thought it was his blue
And
jeans.
he thought it was blue jeans.
Oh my gosh. That poor child. And yes, they'll laugh about that someday.
Yeah.
But that's a really good illustration of how careful you have to be.
And children are so resilient, much more than we adults are. So they work through things through play. We don't have the luxury or the ability to work through play as we get older. So children may seem very upset one minute, and then they're ready to go out and play. And they're not going to sit in the house and cry and grieve, and just like adults do. And then they may come back and feel sad, but their ability to play helps them work through things. And we can use things like puppets and drawings and music and all kinds of different mediums to help them work through that grief.
We have some good handouts too that help parents with how to handle questions at different ages of children.
And where are those resources?
Here at VNA.
Oh, good, excellent. Well, I know VNA has, and you probably led some of these grief classes. So tell me about some of those things that, as people go through this process, or there's, they've got a loved one on hospice care. You've gotten really creative in the grief space in the last year, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but you have. So tell us a little bit about those resources and how you've modified that through the pandemic, and what worked and what made you be able to carry forward in a post-pandemic world.
So we've always been proud of the fact that we offer many grief support groups for families who are bereaved, and bringing them together, whether it be in our office or in a church or some other space. the pandemic hit, and we just kind of twiddled our thumbs for a little bit and thought, oh no, what are we going to do? People are still grieving, even more so now. So we did start some Zoom grief groups for people who had a computer and felt okay about it. We were able to bring people together and have them share their grief with each other. Zoom isn't for everybody. They haven't been as well attended as in-person groups, but we have been successful with them. And they even have a monthly luncheon, some of the what we call bereavement coordinators. So we couldn't bring people together to eat in one location. And they always had a speaker, and they brought a group of people together at lunchtime so people could get back to work. So they have kind of done a mock lunch, and people bring their lunch to the Zoom meeting, and they've brought in a speaker, and they've been able to continue some of those luncheons via Zoom, which have been successful. So
That's great.
it's nice that we've been we had a grief choir last year with a professor from TWU who was interested in grief and music, and they were able to use music as a way to bring people together and work through their grief through music.
Interesting. Can you tell me how that went?
I think it was very successful. I know it was very successful, and they were able to pick songs and sing songs that were meaningful to them. They talked about why they picked that song, why it was meaningful, what that song had to do with their loved one who had passed away. And everybody who attended just got a great deal out of it.
That's amazing.
There's something healing about being around other grieving people.
Definitely. So what prevents people from making the commitment to join, whether it's Zoom, which I think would actually be easier because you can just turn the camera off and just listen. Otherwise, you're all looking at each other with your red noses and your crying eyes in a real meeting. Why are people hesitant to get help in their grief?
Well, I do think there's some aspect of grief that's private. I think you need privacy for part of your grief. And some people might not be the type to attend a support group, but they might have a dear friend that they talk to 10 times a week.
So really,
everyone is just so different. Some people feel like they can handle it on their own. They can handle it by talking to a friend or a clergy person in their life, and they don't have that need to do it in a group that they feel that is a kind of an invasion of their privacy, so they're not willing or able to join a group. A group isn't for everyone, and that's okay. I think the important thing is that grieving people have someone who can listen to them. That's what it's all about, is that listening.
At what point do you say to your loved one or your friend, I'm afraid this is more than grief. I'm worried about you. I feel like it's probably a fine balance of people will grieve on their own time frame, but then when you know someone who's lost a loved one and they're really falling apart still after a long period of time, and you just think, is this normal, or do I need to help this person? Like, can you give us all some guidance on when to intervene and how to intervene, or if to intervene?
Not being able to get the children to school.
Uh-huh.
Forgetting to pick up the children at school.
Okay.
Not being able to get dressed and go to work after a while. And some people work shortened days after a loss, which is a good way to ease back into it. Just not functioning.
Right.
Really, the basic activities of life are very difficult, and then at that point, professional help is warranted.
I think all those things are normal at the beginning, and it is a fine line. When do you call that pathological? And those red flags really become glaring. I think that it's when everything is magnified and nothing ever seems to be getting better. So after a period of time, you don't want to leave your house. You don't want to get dressed. You gain weight or lose weight. You don't want to speak to people in your family. You don't even want to answer the phone. You become more isolated. Or you start some drug and alcohol abuse. So I think that those are the things to look for, but it's the magnitude of those things and the longevity of them. If things don't seem to be getting any better, then I think it's time to reach out to that friend or family member and say, you might need some help. What can we do for you?
Would you say, Gail, after months of not functioning well? Yeah.
So it's really because grief is such an individual process, but really it was the lack of the ability to function in everyday life that is really a red flag. And who might you call? You could call VNA, you could call a spiritual advisor, you could call a professional psychologist or social worker.
Your primary physician might be a good place
Your clergy.
to start.
Right.
Primary care physician is a good one. There's so many resources out in the community. There's so many groups to help people. There's so many private psychologists, social workers, counselors. And there's also, like family service agencies and most of the spiritual groups. There's a Jewish family service and a Catholic charities and a Lutheran social service, and all those major religions have are non-for-profit agencies, and they see people on sliding fee scales.
Oh, nice.
There's also sectarian agencies that are not religiously affiliated that see people on a sliding fee scale. There's the Mental Health Association, there's Child Guidance, there's just so many groups that see people for little or no money. That should not be a barrier to getting help.
Right. In your time as a social worker in the hospice section, tell us a little bit about how you interact with the families and at what point do you come on? We know that someone could be on hospice for a year or 6 days. Now, in a perfect world, we would engage hospice much sooner after the qualifying diagnosis and the referrals from the doctors. But when does a social worker come in, and how do you work with the families to prepare them?
We come on the scene early. Medicare has regulations about the window of time that we have to get out and meet our patient and family.
Okay.
And some patients and families may be reluctant to let us in at the beginning. We have to be creative sometimes about that and figure out an approach that might work with them. Maybe we go with the nurse on a visit, or the chaplain comes with us on a visit. Maybe we talk to them on the phone for a while so they get comfortable with us before allowing us into their home. You just really, when you go out to a new patient and family, you really don't know the personalities until after you've been in the home for a while. So you really have to be creative in thinking about what's going to work with this family. What are the hardest things for you right now? That's one of my favorite questions to ask, because then they get to tell me all the things that are really hard for them.
What are some of their answers?
She won't eat. He keeps us up all night, restless, agitated, throwing things around. We just got this diagnosis. It hasn't even had time to sink in. My dad died of the same disease I'm watching my child die of.
Wow. That's heavy. So do you think that they've already started grieving in some way with the news of the diagnosis?
We humans start grieving along the way. And we start grieving when we see changes in our loved one. They used to be able to walk half a mile with us, and now they're doing good to go a block or getting out of the front yard. We might not even have a diagnosis. We just know something's not right. They're losing a lot of weight. their memory is failing them, they don't have any energy, and then we might go to the doctor, and it might take a while, and then we might get a diagnosis, and we're starting to kick up the grief right there. And then there's maybe more treatment, or maybe there's not. The patient doesn't want the treatment, refuses the treatment. But all along the way, we are grieving. And so I tell my family, so if you're doing any of these things, and I give them a list, I say your sleeping and eating is kind of off kilter, you're more anxious than usual, you're more irritable than usual, you're more forgetful, you're having trouble concentrating. Basically, you just feel like you're not on top of your game, and you feel overwhelmed. And they're like, boy, you just described me. I checked off every box there.
Right.
And I say, you know what that means about you? And they go, what? And I said, it means you're a normal human being.
Right.
And you're going through a normal process. And I say, it is so common, it has a name, and it's called anticipatory grief. We are grieving in anticipation.
That is really important, because that's a word that has really, you start to hear that a lot more frequently now, anticipatory grief. And I really like what you just said. And can you say that one more time? Are you feeling this way? Are you feeling this way? Let's define anticipatory grief, so that if anyone is listening and they say, oh my gosh, that's it.
Okay, so the ways in which it might manifest itself would be trouble eating or sleeping, and it could be either end of the continuum. Some people have a lot of trouble sleeping. It's an escape for them. And some people are waking up every 2 or 3 hours during the night, okay? Sometimes people overeat comfort foods. Probably more commonly, people lose appetites, and they feel like, well, if my loved one can't eat, I shouldn't be eating.
Right.
Or I've just lost my appetite because they've lost their appetite. I don't even want to deal with food. More anxious than usual, more irritable than usual, more forgetful. You go out to the parking lot, not only can you not remember where you parked, you forget what car you drove there.
Oh my.
I mean, that is not unusual.
Right.
Concentration is impaired. Just feeling overwhelmed. I've had families say, my head feels like it's about to explode and I don't have room for anything else. In our families, generally, when they come on service, they are overwhelmed. So we need to be calm. We need to be willing to listen and ask just a few questions. What are the hardest things for you?
I feel like when someone asks how someone else is feeling, how are you feeling? Sometimes I feel like that in and of itself is a healing act. Just to know that someone cares how I'm feeling, genuinely cares how I'm doing. And if you see someone who you know that their mother is ailing, or you know that they have a sick child or whatever, or you know what, if they're going through a divorce or they've lost their job, is to the simple acts of demonstrating that you care, that I'm here to listen, will help them with that grief. It's not going to cure it. Is there a cure for grief?
I don't know that I want a cure for grief.
Why not?
It's a normal human process of life. We are going to love people and we're going to lose people. And grief is kind of the price we pay for loving somebody.
Right, and the closer you are to someone, the stronger your grief will be. What Cindy was talking about with anticipatory grief, I think some of that has something to do with the illness itself. So if you're dealing with a long-term, over a number of year illness like Alzheimer's, the families go through different stages at that point of grief, because they grieve over the original diagnosis, of course, and then they grieve over losses that family member has, so that person is no longer able to remember things. So the family starts grieving over that, about that person. They certainly grieve when that person gets to a point that they don't recognize you.
Right.
How difficult that is for that family member to give and give and give to that person with Alzheimer's, and that person doesn't know who you are. can't recall your name, has no idea who you are. They grieve over that.
That's a huge
stage.
loss if
That's
your
a
parent
huge
doesn't know
loss.
you.
Mhm.
Huge.
And so by the time they get to the death, I'm not saying that the grief is easier, but they've gone through such a long, years-long, many stages of grieving each functional loss, physical and cognitive loss of that person that they love, that it also is very difficult when it comes to the end, because those many losses are just compounded there at the end. Sometimes they feel relief at the end, and then they wonder, should I feel guilt? Am I being selfish and guilty because I feel relief? And
Right.
I always, when I was out in the field, reassured them that that's a very normal feeling. You've been dealing with that for so many years, and feeling relieved at this point for you and that person
Right.
that you love so much is a very normal feeling.
So is relief a part of grief?
It can be.
Can be.
And sometimes I try to set the table by saying, during this phase, you may have a lot of feelings. And I might list a few. And they might say, I feel really bad about this, but I'm going to feel relief when she's gone. And I say, thank you for saying that. And that is perfectly understandable.
Wow. That must be a relief for them to be validated.
Exactly.
In that
And
way.
to know that that's normal.
Right.
And nobody's judging that.
Right.
It's understandable.
We don't want them to feel guilty because they feel relief
Right.
at that point.
So one thing I'm experiencing with the death of my father in December, so many people died in Louisiana last year that we are having a very difficult time resolving his estate. And the courts were not in session, work got backlogged, and then there were so many other things to deal with, and it's very painful for my mother and very painful for some of us in our family. And I feel like as the executor of the estate, I really need for things to get concluded so I can move on. Now, is that fair? Is that rude? Am I being impatient? Because I'm not the only one in this situation. I mean, I've heard so much backlog with the probate courts and all that. And of course, I feel a little guilty about that, but I also feel like, is this never going to end,
Well, I think it's part of what we talked about before. There's certain rituals and certain things that you normally do after a death, and because of this pandemic, those things haven't happened, or they're happening very slowly. So that one of those rituals is probating a will. And if you're unable to do that through no fault of your own, just because of the slowness of the system, because the courts weren't meeting for months
Right.
and months and months, you have no control over that. And so you do feel kind of stuck for a long time. And I do think that makes it more difficult for people. I think what you're feeling is perfectly normal. And I think it's a sense of feeling that you have no control
Right.
over the situation, which leads to such frustration, maybe even anger, questioning, am I bad because
Right.
I want this to move forward? And I think that what you're feeling, again, is so normal, and it's coming to terms with what you truly have no control over.
Right. Which we don't have control over most anything. And we really know that from last year. And I think one of the things that we did grieve as a society over is our loss of control. I mean, the few things we could control is driving to work the way we drive to work, and having dinner where we want to have dinner, and being with the people we want to be with. And when that simply can't happen, this goes back to the sort of earlier in our conversation about the non-death grief. Lack of connection, loss of normalcy, loss of trust in a system, and in medical supplies, in the medical community, and we had to grieve as like that. And then I look at the segment of healthcare. I mean, the healthcare workers, the collective grief that the healthcare workers and those who are responsible for building these huge mass graves or bringing in the trucks and the logistics people, that kind of grief has got to be overwhelming. I mean, what can we do as a society, as part of a community, to lift up those people and professions, that law enforcement officers, military, I mean, all of those people who deal with so much loss as part of their jobs? You know, what can we do as members of the community to help lift them up and help them process their grief?
I think that acknowledging and honoring them, letting them know how much they've been so important in the last year and a half is helpful. I read an article recently that said 1 in 4 people in the healthcare profession are leaving since the pandemic.
Wow, that's
and
scary.
saying that they're not coming back into the profession. We've seen some of that. It's had an accumulative effect, and I think the ramifications of that are going to be for a long time down the road. So I think the more we can thank people, you know, you would see signs in some cities near some of the hospitals that people in apartments would put up banners saying, we thank you. We did some of that in the nursing homes. Our staff would go over and put up a banner at outside the facility because we weren't letting them in, and they were having such a tough time, and some of our staff would put up a banner on the outside of the building thanking them, so that they would just know that somebody cares about them. And, you know, taking them treats. I see pictures of neighborhoods taking baskets of treats to the fire department.
That's so nice.
And just little things like that are so meaningful to people. And I think also one of the most important things I think people can do is to practice patience with each other. So we all get frustrated. You're frustrated with the legal system over not being able to probate an estate, and the attorneys and all those people. And I think just trying to be as patient as possible with people, understanding what it's like in their shoes instead of just knee-jerk reactions. But I think also having a friend or a husband or another family member to say, I'm so frustrated over this, and being able to just have a person that you can vent to and be honest with your emotions is so helpful. So
before we wrap it up, there's a couple things that, you know, if there's anything that I've missed that you would like to talk about, I'd love for you to talk about it. What I've always, since I got involved with VNA, I learned about hospice care. And I had told Olivia Rogers, I said, I was afraid of that word. It was a dirty word, like, Urgh. And then I got familiar with it, and I called it hospice. And going through the process of knowing and getting to know the Visiting Nurse Association staff and the hospice program, and people like Cindy and Gail who oversee it, and Olivia Rogers, who's our chief nursing officer, that's just a tremendous gift. And I think getting people to bring in hospice at the right time, earlier than later, is so important. And I do believe that it will help with the grief process.
So hospice isn't about dying, it's about living. It's about helping people to live in the last passage of their life. I feel so strongly about that, and really focusing on how can we help that person live to the best of his or her ability for however long that might be. We all have no guarantee on what that end date is, and how can we help you and help your family get through this period of your life and live it as well as possible.
You want to go to a graduation out of state? We'll line up a hospice agency to take care of you if you have an emergency out there.
That's
you want to go to the
amazing.
casino because that's what you love to do?
I've had people get on a plane that I thought would never, ever be able to make that trip. But they had a will and a mission to go see somebody or do something that they always wanted to do. And sure enough, they got back and they accomplished what they wanted to accomplish.
That's an amazing celebration of the end of life. Of life, it's a celebration of life while you're still living it, knowing that none of us know when the end is, but knowing that your time is limited. You can't get on hospice without, meeting some criteria that says we know that the end is near. But what an amazing celebration of life to say, I'm going to the casino or I'm going to the Grand Canyon. And this is the last thing I want to do. And, if that's your bucket list, I bet your VNA hospice nurse and your social worker can try to figure out a way to make that happen.
We try.
Yeah.
Often we'll contact other hospices in other cities so that if they have a problem, they have a contact and they will come and see them if there is a medical problem. So we have ways to work around that to make that happen.
I tell my patients who want to go somewhere, you're not under house arrest.
That's right. That's great.
I had one gentleman that played golf.
Oh, that's great.
Up until probably the last 3 or 4 weeks of his life. And it was a pretty day, you're not going to find him at home.
Yeah, that's the way
so
my
great.
husband will be.
And I think that's where we have to make sure people understand what hospice is. You're not hooked up to an IV just waiting, tick, 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 watching the clock. I mean, it is.
Right.
Can you say that again, what you believe hospice is?
Well, hospice isn't about dying, it's about living. And it's helping someone to get through that last passage of their life as meaningfully as possible.
So then, because VNA also offers grief counseling, how long are you with the families? Like, how long are you available to a grieving family?
We ordinarily stay involved with a family for 13 months after the death.
13 months after the death. That's tremendous support.
So what we try to do is we have people on our staff who make phone calls, check in with them, assess how they're coping. We have mailings that we send out every few months with literature about how to cope with grief. And so many times I've had somebody call and say, that mailing came to me just at the right time. I really needed that.
Wow.
And how meaningful that was to them. We have the grief support, all kinds of different grief support groups. We have volunteers who call some of our families and just check in with them.
Tell me about one of those volunteers, Gail.
Well, my husband has been a volunteer for a while, and he makes what are called tuck-in calls every week.
What's that?
And he started doing that during COVID because he used to go out and see patients and actually go and visit with them. But when we had to pull our volunteers out of the field, he was involved in the tuck-in program, and they call the caregiver or the spouse every week and just check on them, see if they need any supplies, if they're low on medications. They usually call on Thursday, and to make sure that people have what they need for the weekend is kind of the idea about it. But in the course of the phone call, they develop very nice relationships sometimes. So they, a lot of times the caregiver will see the phone number and they'll pick up the phone, and my husband's name is Frank, and they'll say, "Hi, Frank." I'm glad,
that's great.
And they'll talk for a while. He'll always ask, "How are you doing?"
Right.
And it really has been a huge success. I think we counted at the end of last month, or maybe it was 2 months ago, that we had made 10,000 phone calls since the program started during COVID.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's 10,000 phone calls in 1 year from VNA volunteers like your husband, Frank.
Just making these tuck-in calls.
Oh, my gosh. That is really remarkable.
Yeah.
What a gift.
And we also have identified certain bereaved persons who might benefit from a little more than that. And we have volunteers who will write a note to them every month. And just a cheerful note or something that's meaningful to them. Just another way to reach out to them. Because we couldn't go and visit families after the death, we usually are staff usually would go and often make a bereavement visit and go to the home and check on them after the death. We couldn't do that, so we developed our Heart Hug program, where we have volunteers who sew, and they make these heart-shaped pillows.
Oh my gosh.
And so we don't do this for every family, but when we ask people if they would like one or we feel they would really benefit, we have a volunteer who would get the Heart Hug and just deliver it on their doorstep.
That's amazing.
And we've gotten such good feedback from families. I think we had somebody call in this week or write a note that just said how much she appreciated, and she goes to sleep with that pillow every night.
Wow. What a gift. You know, truly, in some ways, I think grief is a gift because it's a process that allows us to go through different phases of emotion and hopefully find joy and hope and health. So I do think that having volunteers, hospice volunteers, bereavement volunteers, social workers available, a organization like Visiting Nurse Association that provides content, flyers, web services, Zoom meetings, in-person meetings, to be able to help people through this process that it's in some ways, grief is the great equalizer. You know, we all have that sense of loss, and it's very individual, but it is the great equalizer. Like, loss is loss.
We have our chaplains too, our spiritual support program, and they go in. They don't have an agenda.
Great.
They see people of every imaginable religion, because this area of the country is a real melting pot of many religions. So they try to meet people where they are and bring in literature, scripture that is meaningful to that person. They officiate at funerals if asked. And sometimes somebody wants to speak to a chaplain, but may not want to speak to the social worker or even the nurse about certain things. So the chaplains are available. We don't want to take the place of their rabbi or their pastor, but they're there. They have special training in working with people who are dying, and they're very successful in getting into people and providing that support.
I know they've done baptisms.
And weddings.
A few weddings.
Oh my gosh, that's
over
amazing.
the years. Yeah.
That is amazing. What I experienced, and I noticed it, I'm at the age, so I'm 54 years old as of yesterday, and a lot of my friends were all losing our parents, and I read their obituaries, and there's always a paragraph at the end that says, and I would like to thank hospice care for their love and support in getting us through this. And then, when I wrote my own father's obituary, I said, I would like to thank Jessica at the hospice provider in Louisiana for the love and support and the guidance. And it really occurred to me that those who don't understand what the role hospice plays are really missing out on an opportunity for such healing and peace, and probably help jump starting a healthy grieving process, because it made our lives so much easier. It made my mother's life easier. The social worker called me, the nurse called me, and there was some, interventional things that needed to happen that we heard from the hospice nurse and social worker that my mom was not capable of communicating to us. And I can't stress enough how important it is that people engage with hospice early, because you too will be the one that says, I would like to thank hospice for taking care of my family or my loved one or my dad, because it's such a tremendous gift. And to have an organization, I'm obviously biased, but Visiting Nurses Association, I think they do it the best. It's one of the largest. It's got an incredible reputation. It's been around for like 85 years, and I think our staff is amazing. I mean, you both have been here 16 years, did you say, Cindy? 29 years, Gail. So, it shows that we have an organization that people believe in and like to represent. So, so I'm going back to, is there anything that you want to say about grief, about what you can do or how you can be a resource to families? The community at large doesn't even have to be a VNA client. You know, what have I missed out on?
I think the most important thing is that grief is normal. We can't escape it. And however we go through the stages of grief, or the patient goes through stages of grief, is normal. And that family members and loved ones, friends, will also cope with their grief in their own way, and to be patient with each other and understanding that everybody is different. We would love for people to come on hospice earlier rather than later when they get a terminal diagnosis, because that's when we really can establish a rapport and a relationship with that patient and family and really be of help to them. If we have somebody come on 3 days before they die, we're really just doing crisis intervention, and it's not what we're about. We're there for the long haul to help people get through this stage of their life. We don't come in with an agenda. We're there to hear what is important to you. What can you identify to me that is important to you about the way you want to live the remainder of your life? What would make every day, you just tell me, what would make every day good for you? Somebody might say getting up and having a cup of coffee in the morning is what makes me happy every day.
Or playing golf on a sunny day.
So,
I would say chocolate cake every day.
Yeah, and so why not? We don't have to tell people, you know, that's not good for you. You know, you don't have to watch your sugar intake or salt intake.
We believe in eating for pleasure.
Go ahead and do the things at this point in your life that you truly enjoy doing that are meaningful for you. So we're there to listen. We're not there. I think some people have the misconception that we're going to come in and we're going to tell you, you can't take these medicines, you have to stop this, you can't go outside, you can't go out, you have to be homebound. None of that is true. We're here to help you decide and tell us what's meaningful to you for the rest of your life. And we are going to try to make that happen. Our nurses and doctors are going to try to keep you as comfortable as possible. That's always a very important goal, is to keep someone comfortable so they can enjoy and do the things that are meaningful to them. And we're here to listen to your story. I can't count the number of life stories I have heard in my lifetime working in hospice. And every story is unique. Every person is unique. And how marvelous it's been for me to share in hearing people's lives and stories. And we're guests in their home. That is such a privilege if they're living in their own home. I've always felt, you know, as I said, I did some marriage and family counseling long time ago. It's so different than working in a clinic or an office or in a hospital. People open their door and we're seeing them behind those closed doors. And we are their guests, and we are so privileged to be a part of their lives at that stage of their lives. It's really a gift that they're giving us.
That's such a generous way to look at that.
It's end of life is not a time when they're going to invite a whole bunch of new people in. They don't have the energy or time for that. So yes, they've invited us in. We are their guest.
It has been such a privilege to have this conversation with you, ladies. I'm so blown away by your generosity of spirit and the gifts that you bring to the people who welcome you into their home at a really, you know, it's a tough time in someone's life, regardless of the circumstances of a passing. It's hard for the person and it's hard for the family, the survivors. And so I could not be more privileged to know you. And thanks for the free counseling, by the way. More later after we're off tape. So Gail Meyer and Cindy Nitschke, Thank you so much. I appreciate y'all so much. And
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. For more information about Visiting Nurse Association, please go to www.vnatexas.org or call us at 214-689-0000.